From Yahoo Finance, this is Electionomics. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. And in this week's episode, we'll talk about what America's foreign policy might look like in a Joe Biden White House, especially when it comes to China. Here to talk about it with us is Todd Mariano. He is U.S. Director at Eurasia Group and a foreign policy analyst. Todd, good to have you with us. Lots to dig into here, but want to start with Joe Biden. If he were to win come November, you say he would abandon President Trump's America First approach. And I think for some people, they might think that means, okay, all will be okay with China. He'll roll back the tariffs and we won't have this contentious relationship with China. Are they right to think that?
Well, it's good to be with you, Alexis and Rick, and thank you for having me on. I don't think they're right to think that because there are structural problems in the U.S. China relationship that have been building up for a long time. Obviously, Donald Trump brought his own perspective on these matters and his own methods for dealing with them to his presidency, but he did not create the landscape of the relationship. And in a lot of ways, I think that landscape is going to outlast him. So my general assumption is that Biden is going to employ a different approach towards China, but that certainly will not magically mean that all of the problems in the relationship, all of the irritants, and I think a bit more darkly, all of the ways in which the U.S. and China's national interests are starting to fundamentally clash.
Todd, what has Joe Biden actually said about China and what his approach to China would be and how it might differ from Trump? I haven't heard him say much about this at all.
Well, at the moment, the Biden campaign is actually running ads portraying President Trump as weak on China. And this is, I think, a strategy that the campaign is testing so that I think they recognize that Biden's record at minimum leaves him open to charges from Trump that he's soft on China, because for most of his career, Biden, was sort of part of the standard Washington consensus, which had existed, really since Nixon went to China in the 1970s, which was engage with China rather than oppose China. Biden supported granting permanent normal trading relations with China. He supported China's accession to the WTO. He commented on the campaign trail, although he tried to immediately walk it back sometime last year, I believe it was last summer, that China is not really a threat to the United States, which seemed to be a conception of China more from the early 2000s, where the idea was bring China into the international system rather than trying to confront and contain them. But now the campaign, I think, is moving more towards how do we square the circle that Biden and other Democratic primary candidates laid out for us, which was that we would still confront China where it's in America's interest to do so, but we would do that in a less disruptive way than Trump. I'm not sure. In fact, I'm actually fairly sure that the campaign doesn't have a detailed policy answer to that yet. But I think that's the problem that they're setting for themselves, which is a bit more confrontational a posture than Biden's been used to during his long years in Washington.
Do you think is this an issue where Biden really needs to have a clear policy? Let's keep in mind here, this election is most likely to turn on what happens in 6 or 8 swing states. We keep repeating that here because this is just the way it's going to go. It's Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, let's say. How much does China as an issue even matter in those places?
It's a good question, and you're absolutely right about the Electoral College being the correct framework for looking at the election rather than the popular vote, which I expect Biden to win handily. I think that China does matter in those states. It's different in each state for sure. The more agricultural states certainly have been impacted by the trade war with China and Chinese retaliation. to Trump's tariffs, and they've therefore also been helped, at least theoretically, by Chinese promises to buy more agricultural goods. The manufacturing states, I'm not sure that, beyond some high profile instances, that in a structural sense, manufacturing has begun to move back to the United States. We do see impact on supply chains, or at least nodes of those supply chains starting to move out of China, um, or at least contemplate moving out of China. But that doesn't mean, a new renaissance in U.S. manufacturing. I mean, from a business perspective, the bottom line is what matters. So there is support certainly in Washington on both sides of the aisle for manufacturing moving back, but we haven't really seen that to a significant sense as a result of President Trump's China policy. So I think that would matter for a lot of those states because they are states where manufacturing once flourished and then famously dried up. But I don't think that they're seeing that major new leg up. So China matters there for them, both short term and long term. Does Biden need an absolutely detailed playbook of what he's going to do with China on the campaign trail? No, he mainly needs some some campaign slogans and a general conception for what he's going to do with China. But this I see as a major question mark for markets and for multinational businesses in 2021 is that policy formation process, because that won't be resolved. Biden wins before he takes office. It won't be resolved in the transition. This will be a major output of his first year in office, with various camps, arguing for various things, and he's got to be the one to arbitrate between them. But that's something that will take some time.
So let's just talk about this situation with China at the moment. I mean, it's a volatile relationship between the United States and China right now, in part because of what President Trump has tried to do on trade, but also China now passing this new national security law with regard to Hong Kong. It looks like a crackdown on Hong Kong is coming, and that's going to be probably a global hotspot in that sense. Do you think by election day, President Trump is going to be able to? I think he will declare victory on China, whether there's a victory or not, but will he be able to plausibly claim that he actually got anything done with regard to China at all? What do you think about that?
I think he will certainly claim that the phase one trade deal is, again, kind of putting it in his terms, something that no other president before him had done or was capable of doing. That he's the only president who stood up to China. I mean, certainly in recent history, he's the only president that kind of went toe to toe and punched China in the nose in order to get them to the negotiating table. And he will say the phase one deal is an output of that. The issue, kind of from a more analytical perspective, is that I think that the major structural problems in the relationship have not been addressed by phase one. I think phase one was mainly a way to, number one, give Trump, I think, a win for the campaign trail, and I expect him to market it heavily. Number two, from the perspective of diplomacy, to give the two sides some interest in continuing negotiations, which is that, normally the conception was nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, kind of leading this in the government, changed that to let's lock something in so that both sides have an interest in continuing on to the far more difficult phase two issues, rather than keeping these kind of low level things like agricultural purchases or things like that for a later date. I expect Trump will talk about phase one a good deal on the campaign trail. He already has. Hong Kong, I think, is a potential risk to the trade deal, What's sort of interesting from my perspective, though, is that Lighthizer is correct. Both sides have an interest in keeping phase one. China does not want new tariffs, and Trump does not want to hit markets with new tariffs on China or going back to tariffs. Whatever they would decide to do in that case. At a time when coronavirus has completely upended the global economy. So, in some sense, I think the fight has simply moved on to other areas. Hong Kong is the most acute of those areas at the moment. But whether it's Trump or Biden in 2021, they will probably have to deal with Taiwan. They will probably have to deal with South China Sea. The naval and Air Force exercises that took place there over the weekend were an indicator that the U.S. is determined to maintain its interests there. There are geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic, the whole suite of geo issues between the U.S. and China that clearly were not resolved by the phase one trade deal, and I think only get more difficult and more expansive, whether it's Trump or Biden in 2021.
Do you see a situation, Todd, where Biden would actually get aggressive, even when it comes to, instituting more tariffs on China? Do you see him perhaps maybe kind of the pendulum swinging and him taking a much harder stance than I think anyone might imagine? And might he need to get that across to even win the White House?
Alexis, it's like you're suggesting, does he need to out-Trump Trump?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Exactly.
Yeah, well, many have tried to out-Trump Trump. All have failed to date. But I think that Biden is certainly, I would say his advisors are trying to push him to that place. And it's against his instincts, because his instincts hearken from an era where quiet engagement with Chinese officials was the MO of how Washington dealt with China. And again, I think his advisors and the leading lights in foreign policy in the Democratic Party are trying to come up with a new framework for how to deal with China, because they will never put it this way. But I do think Trump has proven that there are not only issues in the relationship that are affecting Americans right now, but he's also proven, I think, that the previous framework for dealing with U.S. China relations failed to meaningfully constrain China's ambitions on the global stage. They failed to prevent the rise of a leader like Xi Jinping, which is a major factor here that I think often gets elided in U.S. discussions of U.S. China policy, because it understandably becomes all about Trump. But it's just as much, if not more so, about Xi Jinping, in my view. And they really failed to bring China into the system, rather than China joining that system, using it to its advantage, and trying to turn international institutions toward its own interests, which is what rising global powers do. So I think that Democrats are simply recognizing reality and trying to push Biden to a more confrontational posture. Where he'll differ from Trump is that I think he will try to get more aggressive, but he will try to do so with the Europeans on his side, with Five Eyes countries. He will try a more multilateral approach. I tend to be skeptical of how much that approach could work, or at least how quickly, because in the past, we've seen a lot of multilateral approaches that sound nice. There's a great communique, but the actual deliverables have been not really noteworthy. What's different this time is that I think Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there is a strong consensus among the democratic developed countries that the problems in their relationships with China, the problems with China's economic strategy, the problems with China's geopolitics have now come to a head. So I do think they are more determined than ever before to put real skin in the game and join the U.S. in confronting, China, and that works to the advantage of Biden, whose instincts will say, let's not be pugnacious, let's not go it alone. However, this is a problem that we need to deal with. In fact, I would say whoever the president is in 2021, even 2024 and on, this is the major problem that they need to deal with, because this is a transformation of the world that we've known since the end of the Cold War.
Todd, I read your research. You've mentioned here the people advising Joe Biden on China, and I've seen some of the names you've mentioned in some of your reports. Could you just tell us, I think these are people that are well known inside the Beltway, but not outside the Beltway. Can you just tell us a couple of the people likely, if Biden were to win, likely to emerge as whatever it might be, his trade representative, or whoever would end up being the Secretary of State, obviously, who might end up being the person actually dealing with this issue on the ground in a Biden administration?
Sure, it's always a big question for a transition, and naturally there's a lot of jockeying for positions and tryouts, so to speak, that happen long before the election actually takes place. What we see and hear so far. Number one, the campaign, both on foreign and economic policy, has actually, at least publicly, played its cards very close to the vest in terms of who is actually the most influential. And in both cases, the cast of folks who are actually, in our understanding, influential behind the scenes are a smattering of Obama officials, people who served Biden in the Obama administration, Clinton administration officials, and certainly some senators. And I think all of that speaks to Biden's longevity in Washington. What we see, though, is that it's tended to be more kind of at the deputy level so far. And you mentioned Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, certainly a big cog in the Washington foreign policy machine. There we see Bill Burns, who was a career Foreign Service officer who rose to Deputy Secretary of State, was highly involved with all sorts of things, especially in the Middle East and the Iran nuclear deal during the Obama administration. Secretary of Defense, most people in Washington believe that Michelle Flournoy will be the first female Secretary of Defense under Biden. In all of these positions for national security, I think that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, whose ascendancy has been quite clear since 2016 and never more clear than in the 2020 primary, will try to affect these personnel decisions, particularly if Democrats retake the Senate, which is a big question mark, I think, for November, but now probably more likely than not to happen. But the progressive wing is usually more focused on domestic policy than foreign policy. Foreign policy, they seem to follow the Sanders and frankly Trump policy of just not embroiling the U.S. in major new foreign wars. But there's a lot of other names that are involved in this. Kurt Campbell, who's a longtime Democratic foreign policy official and leading mind, Eli Ratner and Tony Blinken are the names that most often get mentioned and who are clearly, I think, very influential on this in the campaign at the moment.
Let me go back to what is really an important bottom line question for a lot of U.S. businesses and for financial markets. Do you think the tariffs that Trump has imposed would go away if Biden became president? And if they did, what would replace them as a cudgel, if you will, against China?
Yeah. I think you've cut straight to the heart of it there. I don't expect that they would go away immediately. I do expect that they would eventually go away. And from Biden's perspective, he's sort of handcuffed on day one of his presidency if he wins, because to simply remove the tariffs would give China a major win, essentially without giving anything in return. And I think no U.S. leader is going to do that, whether they agree with the policy or not, which I don't believe that Biden does agree with the policy. In general, I expect him to focus on the bilateral trade balance a lot less than Trump, and to hopefully view the U.S. China relationship more holistically, more expansively. What that means is that he would remove the tariffs probably as part of a larger deal with China, something probably akin to how Trump administration casts phase two. And the tariffs will still be his cudgel and his interest. So it's actually, in that sense, at least a gift from Trump to Biden, which is that he gets to use the upside of the tariffs without the downside of being identified with them. But that's a process that could take a year or two.
So given that, there's this interesting narrative about what China wants, what the China hopes the outcome of the U.S. presidential election is. So you would think, given everything you just said, you would think that China would like to see Biden win because that's how they get out of the tariffs. But there's this counter narrative out of, based on some reporting out of Beijing, that China actually likes dealing with Trump. They think that the problems he poses them on trade are worth it because he is weakening the U.S. standing in the world, which is an opportunity for China, and that they would actually like to see China reelected. What do you have a view on that?
That's one reason. A very smart former colleague of mine points out that the Chinese bureaucracy is not as inscrutable as we think. They actually tip their hand all the time. It's just that very, very few of the ways in which they tip their hand are translated into English. And what you see when you review some of their thinking on this is that human rights issues, as well as the sort of what you were talking about, which is the multilateral versus the bilateral or unilateral approach. Human rights and a multilateral approach, I think China also views as a threat. So it's not all about the trade deficit and tariffs for them either. We've seen what they've done in Hong Kong, which happened a lot earlier than a lot of people suspected. We've seen what they've been doing in Xinjiang province for a long time. We've seen the wolf warrior diplomacy. I think the Chinese leadership has clearly decided it's time for a more aggressive Chinese foreign policy, and that the era of biding their time and hiding their strength is long since over. So Biden, I think for him, the human rights abuses, as they were for Hillary Clinton and for others in the Democratic Party, are very important. When the Chinese think of Nancy Pelosi, they think back to her appearance in Tiananmen Square. These are critical national interests for China as well. I'm not, espousing their point of view on it or anything like that. It's just, I think, important to understand that from their point of view, these human rights issues are strategic for them. They're about the integrity, the territorial integrity and the political integrity of the country as they conceive it. And I think they're worried that Biden may be able to unite Western opposition to some of these issues, and he may focus on them more than Trump, who has tended to, as other presidents have before, downplay these issues in favor of what he views to be more important U.S. interests in the relationship.
I think we can safely bet that China is going to be or play a big part in debates between Trump and Biden, if and when we get them leading up to November. But I want to thank Todd Mariano, foreign policy analyst at Eurasia Group, for joining us on this episode of Electionomics. Be sure to rate and review what you just heard and saw, and follow me at Alexis TV News on Twitter. Rick?
And me at Rick J. Newman. And I don't know how anybody could rate this less than 5 stars. Where do you get this deep a dive on China relations on air anywhere?
It's tough.
It is definitely. Thank you. Great to be with you.
Todd, do you have a Twitter handle or
I do not. I'm on LinkedIn if people want to connect.
Sounds good. You know, LinkedIn doesn't get a lot of love when it comes to these promos, but absolutely look up Todd Mariano on LinkedIn. And thanks so much for being with us. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.